All right, ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin our final panel. Today, the fourth and final panel is on demographics and culture, where the world is headed. Today, we have Dr. David Coleman, Anne Elizabeth Moutet, Professor El Mustafa Rezazi, and Dr. James Carafano on the panel, and we will be moderated by Dr. Gladden Pappin. Ma'am, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you so much, Logan. Well, you've already done an excellent job introducing our panelists, so I'll just say one word about the topic of the panel. Demographics has clearly become a major geopolitical issue, and that's something of which there has been increasing acknowledgement. Arguably, it's something that, at least within Europe, Hungary realized first in 2015. Just last week, the Budapest Demographics Summit, which was started in 2015 to bring attention to everything from demography to family policy to migration as geopolitical, not simply national issues. So to continue that theme within the framework of this excellent conference, we have our guests assembled today to talk about demographics and cultures, where is the world headed? So Dr. David Coleman is Emeritus Professor of Demography at the Department of Social Policy at Oxford. So if you would be so kind as to commence your presentation, we listen attentively.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is a topic I think much thought about, sub rosa, but very little talked about, especially in public, and very little written about as well. It's about what happens when you have high migration moving into a country which appears to be without limit and which appears to be either incapable of being stopped or where the government concerned has no wish to stop it. Where the birth rate of that country is low and falling, and what happens as a consequence. The most important question, I think, is not so much those important variables, but rather whether it matters or not. Most people would possibly think that it does matter, but I suspect that quite a large and growing number of people will feel that the consequences of population change, which these two processes interact to generate, actually doesn't matter very much, especially younger people compared to the old. Anyway, let us see. You probably aren't necessarily relishing a huge wad of demographic data late on a Friday afternoon in the warmth, but nonetheless, I will try and keep that to a reasonable minimum. The question, therefore, is minority status inevitable for indigenous populations? That means essentially the people here living in Europe and the United States, giving way to migrant-descended populations, mostly from the developed world. This does appear to be implicit in current trends at the moment. Domestic fertility is low and has suddenly taken a lurch downwards, rather unexpectedly. There's a gap between immigrant fertility and indigenous fertility, if I can use the word indigenous. There's no real accepted word for the locals in Europe or the United States. There's a constant gap between the birth rate of immigrant populations and those who live in those countries. The foreign origin population increases quite substantially now, over 20% in most European countries, and growing quite fast. In the United Kingdom, anyway, there is no real coherent political opposition to it. it may be there shouldn't be, but probably most people would expect there would be. There certainly is very vociferous and not always very pleasant opposition to it in European countries, in France, as you may hear later on, in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats, in Germany with Alternative für Deutschland, and various other European countries, not in the UK. Really rather interesting. The elite, I know very well, indifferent to the processes of population change implicit in these patterns of fertility and of migration. And I think there's also a major culture shift going on affecting attitudes to migration and to very many other things as well, authority, religion, and everything else, which will accommodate itself much more easily to such ethnic change as may be taking place. This is a very interesting remark by Sajid Javid, very recently, just in the last month. He was confronted with some data about the transition of major cities in Britain, London and others, into minority status, where the white population has acquired minority status, and his response was, so what? And it's really an excellent question, so what? I'll return to that later on at the end, but perhaps I could say something about the processes in the meantime. Low fertility. Throughout the entire developed world, birth rates are below the level required to replace the population in the long run. That's normally taken to be a birth rate equivalent to about 2.1 children per woman. That's not exactly what it is, but that's good enough. In East Asia, the birth rate is so low that it has become an existential threat, with extinction forecast in some exciting population projections. And the birth rate, already fairly low in some European countries, has recently taken an unexpected step downwards, as we will see. This is a real change. What it means is, throughout the world, the majority of the world's population now lives in countries where the birth rate is lower than that required to replace the population, and that's over 100 countries, including some large ones, which I've listed here. Now, you may think I'm stretching things a bit by including Bangladesh and India and one or two others in this list where the birth rate is equivalent to almost 2 children or just over 2 children. Then I can get away with that because the replacement level of fertility depends upon the death rate. If the death rate is relatively high, then the replacement rate has to be high as well. And the death rate in Bangladesh and in India is sufficiently higher than in the rest of the world to require the replacement rate to be somewhat more than 2.1. Not much, but a bit. The worst cases in East Asia. Here are the countries apparently heading for oblivion: Japan and the 4 little dragons, including Korea. Korea is the world leader in alarmingly low birth rates. The birth rate there is equivalent to a birth rate of to about a family size of 0.7 children, if you can imagine what 0.7 children looks like. The experts in Korea see no particular reason why it shouldn't fall even lower. And the rest of them are following suit. And you can see that the tail end of the graph of the most recent years is dipped down even further than it had been before. This has led to one of the most spectacularly pessimistic entries in any official website that I've ever been aware of. This is copied from an official Japanese statistical website from an agency of the Japanese government, and shows the end of the Japanese population. The blue line is the projected decline of the population of Japan up to the year 3000. Given the then birth rate of equivalent to about 1.4 children and a constant level of mortality. The red line is the support ratio, the number of people of nominal working age to the number of people of retired dependent age. That, you see, goes down to a lower level, but then remains constant. This is an important feature of demography, that given a constant birth rate, given a constant death rate, you acquire a constant self-replicating age structure. So that's all right, sort of all right. That does not apply to the population size. That goes down in that rather elegant curve, as you see, and it doesn't go beyond the year 3000 because in the year 3000, the last Japanese dies, according to this projection. And Korea has produced a similar but still somewhat secret population projection in which the Korean population beats Japan to extinction by a short head.
Koreans always want to outbeat the Japanese.
Well, they've done it again. I don't believe these projections, by the way, but nonetheless, they are the infallibly arithmetical consequence of the assumptions which go into them. Another low fertility region is Southern Europe. Southern Europe being Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain, essentially. And they've converged together, moving really in very similar ways over time, just as the Four Little Dragons in Japan have done. That is in itself an interesting demographic phenomenon, of which we haven't got time to discuss. Note, by the way, this has got nothing to do with the Pope or Catholics, because Greece, as you all will know very well, is an Orthodox country and has no allegiance to His Holiness whatsoever. But Greece is going to hell just as Italy and Portugal and Spain are for the purposes of the low birth rate. This isn't quite as bad as in East Asia. These are about 2.4. 1.4, 1.3, not 0.7 as in Korea. We, of course, aren't like that. We're different. We've been different for a long time. By we, I mean Northern Europe, the central part of Western Europe, the Anglosphere abroad, and one or two other places. Here we have the United Kingdom, constituent countries. The red line is England and Wales, and you can see that it nudges too round about the year 2010, although then it goes down. And you can see the poor Scots in blue are losing the plot and joining the also ran in the rest of the world, doubtless depressed by the prospect of secession from the United Kingdom. Instead, we have these two groups of higher, I put in inverted commas, higher fertility countries. The North and Western European countries and the Anglosphere, and here they both are graphed with the United Kingdom altogether. And you can see once again, these countries are behaving as a group. They get closer and closer and closer in their responses to their economic and other aspects of their environment, behaving very similar, going up and down with economic booms and busts and all the rest. And those days, unfortunately, are over. You can see here a number of relatively high fertility countries which have been bumbling around at just under 2 children per woman for most of the time since the 1970s. Really quite reassuring. This sort of underpinned confidence in the likely continuation of Western civilization. But just recently, just in the last 7 or 8 or 9 years, they've taken a dive downwards and have gone below levels never previously seen in terms of the low birth rate. In the UK, just under 1.5. In the case of Finland, shock horror, 1.35, which appall the Finns, who, like other Nordics, have prided themselves on the high level of fertility which their country had generally maintained ever since the Second World War. Not really quite close to 2 throughout. They went down to 1.35, which was really extraordinary and rather defies explanation. There is some consolation in the sense that you can find examples where birth rates go up as well as go down. These are the birth rates in Central and Eastern Europe. They were plunged right deep down into the doldrums after the end of communism, when the rug was pulled from all those subsidies which kept the birth rate relatively high in the communist countries, not replaced by anything, by prosperity or hope or high levels of employment or productivity. And so the birth rate went right down to not all that far above 1, but it's gradually recovered in a rather optimistic way, up to not to replacement level by any means, but certainly to a more healthy level where they are between 1.5 and nearly 2 in a few cases. Perhaps I could mention that some demographers, most demographers, reckon there's a kind of safe space in the birth rate, that if it's at least 1.7 or at a pinch 1.6, then you have the development of a population age structure where the process of aging and the ratio of dependents to producers is such that it's possible to imagine non-demographic solutions, increasing the age of pension, of retirement, for example, increasing productivity, increasing workforce participation, that will cope with the extra burden which the population aging necessarily imposes. Below that level, it's much more difficult. But what is going on? Why should the birth rate suddenly start to dip down to levels not previously seen in Western Europe? There are two groups of causes, it seems to me. Some of them are rather mechanical and economic in nature, where perhaps the most important are the responses to the crises of recent years, the economic crisis of 2008, the Ukraine war, the COVID disaster, and all the rest. These are hammer blows which quite reasonably depress economic activity. They depress the birth rate. They depress expectations. They make people uncertain, not the least because their prospects for employment are made much more shaky than they were as well. And there are other economic processes going on which are unhelpful. The rise of non-standard, non-guaranteed employment, for example. In the case of the UK, the outrageous cost of childcare and processes of that kind, and the shortage of housing, which incidentally is substantially due to apart from all sorts of the usual incompetences, due to the very, very high level of migration. Most of the additional households in the UK come from people born overseas, not from domestic generation. But apart from that, and rather more importantly, I think, more interestingly, is a group of factors in that group that I put at the bottom of the page. Now, these are ones where it's so far impossible to put a number, and this is very unsatisfactory because in demography, as another aspect of social science, what you want to be able to do is to give a number to the relative importance of a factor causing a certain outcome. We can't do that. Nonetheless, these are, I think, plausible factors which are more concerning in a way than the transient economic problems which I mentioned a moment ago. They are to do with a very substantial value shift which appears to be going on, according to opinion surveys, whereby the young especially are adopting values and attitudes which are much less conducive to maintaining the old way of doing things compared to the past, to do with law and order, to do with discipline, to do with obedience to parents, to do with respect for any kind of tradition. All very interesting and very progressive, but not helpful from the point of view of certain aspects of maintaining the culture. There's concern about climate change, much more widespread than it was, and previously one could dismiss concern about climate change as the obsession of a few cranks. Nowadays, that concern is so pervasive that it does appear to be influencing an interestingly large number of people in their reproductive decisions. And there's also a much lower level of trust than used to be the case, partly, I think, arising out of greater ethnic diversity. And one of the factors behind higher birth rates is a high level of trust. If trust in general erodes, the birth rate goes with it. And therefore, the demographers are puzzled. Here are some comments of gurus. One guru is Anne Gauthier. I'm pleased to see a former student of mine, made very good. She's scratching her head about what's going on. Below a quote from Wolfgang Lutz, the guru's guru, a very prominent man in European demography, who is also baffled to know what is going on in detail, despite the reasonably plausible explanations which I offered a little while ago. The other aspect which I mentioned is not just declining fertility, it is rapid migration. This is the graph of net international migration in thousands to the UK from 1964 to 2022. As you can see, it starts off negative. The tradition of migration in respect of the UK and much of Western Europe was, of course, emigration, not immigration. From the 1990s onwards, it's been consistently upwards and took a huge boost in the 1990s after the advent of the Blair government and a radical change of policy concerning migration and its desirability. And then we have a yet further boost just recently, taking it up to 600,000 net arrivals in 2022, which is really quite mind-blowing. It can't remain at that level, one assumes. It's to do with Ukraine and to do with Hong Kong and various unexpected developments. Nonetheless, it may be a little now stabilized at around 300,000 or so, which has been the figure for the last few years. That, of course, in a country of 68 million people makes quite a big difference. This is the percentage population of England and Wales, born outside the UK, going up from 4.5 million in 2001 to 10 million in 2021. Really very rapid addition to the population. All population growth in Britain for some years now has been due to international migration, not to internal processes of population growth. And something similar is the case in other European countries as well. And it's also often the case that immigrant groups have somewhat higher birth rates than the locals. By no means always. In Britain at the moment, the Indian population has a lower birth rate than the population average. The Chinese group has a birth rate lower than the population average. Pakistanis and Bangladeshis are higher. So it's a mixed story, but on average a little bit higher. And this graph shows the difference between the groups in the top who are foreign origin and those who are the natives in a number of European countries, as you can see. The power of migration, therefore, to alter the size of a population and add people of non-indigenous origin is very great. These are a series of population projections of the UK up to 2086. Assuming a birth rate similar to that of the present time, about 1.5. And as you can see, depending on whether it's zero, we have population decline, the blue line at the bottom, and if, the blue line at the top is what happens if that amazing migration of 600,000 continues into the future, which I don't believe it will. And the others are intermediate levels of migration. There are, of course, consequences to this. Chairman, how much time have I got?
It's about time to start wrapping up.
Oh, heavens. This clock is not very helpful. Anyway, here is ethnic change in the UK. The top line graph is the percentage of the population of vaguely British ethnic origin. The solid line is the population of immigrant origin, and the hatched line is one of white people of non-British origin. Those two lines on that projection converge in about 2066, rather appropriately 1,000 years after Hastings, and that's when the white British become a minority on that projection. And of course, please remember, it's only a projection. All projections are always wrong, and that's far too precise a date to give. Nonetheless, that's what would happen if those things were remained as they were. That was published 10 years ago. Since then, immigration is substantially higher the birth rate is substantially lower. Therefore, the crossover point will be much closer to the present. I'll skip that if I'm running out of time. This is something happening throughout the world. Here is the US with a confident prediction of a majority-minority situation by about, I think, 2042 is the Bureau of the Census forecast. Here is the Netherlands showing the difference between percent of population of foreign origin in red with migration and without in the blue line. This is a collection of such projections. There aren't that many for different European countries. Here are some European countries, plus the US, plus one or two others, all trending in the same direction, showing moving up to about 30-35% of population of foreign origin by mid-century on the basis of those projections. And please remember, of course, they are only projections. And this is Sweden's last ethnic forecast. The Swedes decided it wasn't very nice to make projections of that kind. This is the last one that they made, also showing a rise of 35% by 2060, and we haven't heard anything more of that from Sweden's. The UK government appears to be unaware of this, appears not to take a view about it. The electorate, I think, is rather apathetic because it's been promised so many times that migration will be controlled, and so many times that hasn't happened. The elite is indifferent or approving to the prospective change that might take place. There's great self-censorship by the media, by publishers and others. There is the discussion of the issue would be very embarrassing to raise. It's difficult. It may well be that a tipping point has now changed, has now been reached because there are so many voters now of ethnic minority origin, including those who aren't even British citizens, that their influence may be too great for any political party to antagonize. So what? It's always assumed the British public and the public in the other European countries wouldn't like this development to become a minority in their own country. It is not clear this is any more the case. It may be that the indifference to these changes in the newly liberal young, which I alluded to earlier on, is now so pervasive and so important that when this comes to pass, assuming government takes no steps to respond to it, of which there's no indication whatsoever, then it'll just pass by without too much notice. After all, London is already a majority-minority city, so are very many others in the country, Birmingham and Manchester. It may well be that as this becomes more likely, it will matter to most people, to many people, much less, and will just be, one hopes in a peaceful way, to happen and be taken for granted. There are some mitigating factors which I won't mention, but it may be, therefore, that these are the faces of the future. You may recognize the chap on the left at the top. The chap at the bottom is Lewis Hamilton, the world's greatest motor racing driver. The lady on the right is Miss Albigeois, a beauty queen who was dismissed for some minor peccadillo by the hateful French authorities, and one hopes perhaps she might seek asylum in Britain instead. So what would appear to have been completely unimaginable 40, 50, 60 years ago, seems to me to be quite likely to come to pass, to encounter less and less opposition and hardly any comment, and certainly no government action in the UK. May well pass off as peacefully as has the acquisition of minority status by the indigenous in London and many other places when that becomes general. But it will become, as Professor Betts pointed out earlier on today, it'll be a gulf, something of a gulf between the town and the country, with this process being primarily urban in nature and hardly affecting the country at all. What it will be like politically and culturally to live in to live in such a society, we don't know. It hasn't been tried before, as far as I know. It'll be something which some people here anyway will come to experience. I won't, but it'll certainly be interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coleman. It's now my privilege to welcome to the Danube Institute once again our good friend Anne-Elizabeth Moutet, columnist from The Telegraph and Unheard, to tell us whether indeed France is finally looking at her immigration problems.
Right, yes. I come without statistics for one very good reason that will come out of my article, and therefore this is why you saw no French statistics in David's presentation. And as a journalist, I'm going to present what things look like from, I would say, the ground floor. We had been expecting almost all year what will pass in the European Parliament this autumn, in a few days. It will start discussing a political hot potato, which is our new immigration law, entitled Bill to Control Immigration, Improve Integration. This is coming to us just after videos of Lampedusa Island in Italy being sort of swamped by over 10,000 mostly African migrants has put the issue on top of the news again. This is twice as much as the local population. They feel overwhelmed, and that's quite understandable. The immigration bill that was prepared by the Emmanuel Macron government is tabled for November. The National Assembly the Senate will discuss it in November, and the National Assembly will discuss it early in 2024. But the title of the bill already gives the nature of the problem. If it says to control immigration, that would mean that perhaps it is uncontrolled, and if it says improving integration, may very well mean that it is not going well. And still, for a long time, France has been a country of immigration, and it felt that it was managing it better than most. The notion of citizenship dates from the French Revolution, before we had regions. But before that, long before that, Celt and Teutonic tribes in antiquity, Vikings in the early Middle Ages were changed by the nature of the country and settled in. Foreigners were always attracted to France. It's a vast agricultural country that needs laborers, with governments, aristocracy that welcomed craftsmen, artists, soldiers, and politicians. So, in no particular order, we can quote Leonardo, Lully, Gluck, Cardinal Mazarini, the Marshal of Saxon, the Prince of Ligne, Rossini, Donizetti, Kosciuszko, and later Picasso or Charles Aznavour, on and on. We are a country of immigrants. One French person out of three can trace their ancestry to immigrants. And this is before the last 50 or 75 years. But the first modern waves of immigration in France date from the Industrial Revolution. This in France develops in the second half of the 19th century, so you have laborers who are coming from the Piedmont and Belgium, Spain, and the German states. Then you have the Russian Empire in the mid-80s. The Jews, Poles, Romanian, Ukrainians. On the eve of the First World War, the largest immigrant group were the Italians in 1911 exactly. They were over 1/3 of the third immigrant population in France, and about 1% of the population of France. New waves included, at that time, Chinese and Vietnamese workers. Famously, one of the Chinese workers was Deng Xiaoping, who later would become the chief of the Chinese government. Poles, Czechs, and Armenians. By the 1930s, you had almost 3 million foreigners in France, about 6% of the French population. Many of them obtained French nationalization, and since 1889, that children born in France by law became French when they reached the majority. Immigration from France's African and Maghreb colonies then developed in the 50s and 60s during the country's post-war reconstruction, and the mid-century industrial development that we know in France as the post-war 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. We had 5 to 7% annual growth, full employment, and the country was rebuilding itself. So all of this is a story of happy immigration. And until then, we see the history of immigration in France as a history of success. That is not to say that there were no hostile reactions, especially in times of economic slump. For instance, in 1881, there was a Marseillais Vespers, an anti-Italian pogroms in Marseille. It left 3 dead and 21, yes, seriously injured. And still, much later, the autobiography of François Cavana, the founder-editor of Charlie Hebdo, who was born of Italian parents, wrote this book was entitled L'Hérital, which is a familiar but slightly derogatory name for Italian workers. All at the same time, the same Cavana integrates so well that he creates one of the institutions of modern France. It's this irreverent weekly that was targeted in 2015 by Islamists in a bloody massacre of 11 of its cartoonists and journalists. Many of you know Asterix the Gaul. I know the Asterix comics have been translated into Hungarian. Asterix the Gaul is very much a portrait of the typical French soul of the 1960s and 1970s. And he is the brainchild of 2 sons of immigrants, René Goscinny, who is a Polish-Argentine Jew, and Albert Uderzo, who's an Italian again. His parents were stonemasons. And as long as you become French, speak French, adopt French culture, whether you are Marie Curie, Josephine Baker, or Amin Maalouf, France welcomes you. In Austro-Hungarian terms, as we are in Budapest, this is very close to the view of Joseph Roth, a Galician Jew of the empire's nationalities supporting the Habsburg in his masterpiece novel, The Radetzky March. This model got broken in the 1960s and 1990s, and the French have many explanations for this. But if one steps back, we are talking about an international phenomenon. We can see it in America, where the notion of the melting pot has now become an insult. We can see it in Western Europe, from Belgium to Britain, where entire areas of cities have become ethnic enclaves, where the everyday mode of life belongs to other places and other continents. As immigrants make fewer efforts to assimilate, they become less and less teachable or employable, and more of a weight to the host societies. It has taken a long time for mainstream institutions in France to accept this, and perhaps this is our fault. Miraculously, teachers in banlieue school, where 90% of the children's mother tongue is not French, have still been expected to integrate these children the way 3 foreign-speaking kids out of 30-strong class were supposed to absorb French, and usually did. It does not work any longer. Bad school results correlate with petty and not so benign crime levels, and the result has been a dumbing down of the national curriculum. Even then, exam results and discipline have become so poor that responsible parents, foreign and French-born alike, pull their children out of the school system to send them to private institutions, which happen not to be terribly expensive in France because they're subsidized. The French state school system, which was for decades one of the best in the world, has slipped to the bottom of the PISA league tables. Most public services in France have been impacted in the same way. Hospitals, crèches, welfare officers. The police is finding it hard to hire and has had to lower the duration of training from 1 year to 8 months. It has one of the highest rate of suicide of all professions in France, and many resign in sheer exhaustion as their badly paid and badly considered job becomes more dangerous. And the same happens in many public hospitals as nurses and doctors are confronted with aggressive patients and their families and demands, for instance, that women should not be treated by male doctors. The same also happens for bus and train drivers and conductors, on and on. Recent waves of immigration in France means that registered foreign nationals, which we are allowed to count, numbered 8,651,000 at the beginning of 2023. That already represents 12% of the French population, but it is far from the whole story, because France, since 1945, and for perfectly noble reasons, forbids ethnic or religious statistics. The reason is that what was known as the Fichier des Juifs, the official statistical figures on French Jewish citizens and residents, were turned by the Nazis into a practical tool for deportations. At the liberation, that thermometer was legally broken. There are many more unregistered foreigners in France. There are also quite a few of their French children and grandchildren who, unlike their parents, have not integrated and whom you saw on the news rioting and looting back in July and at other times. The French hard right has been denouncing the problems with immigration for years, but it is no wonder that for the first time, mainstream voices are now asking for an end on the ban on ethnic and religious statistics. One of them is that of Dominique Régnier. He is a political scientist. His career in the bastions of the French establishment at Sciences Po and now the Fondation pour l'Innovation Politique means that many of the current decision makers in government and in opposition have been his schoolmates or his students. Régnier has conducted assessments of the cost of unchecked immigration to the country in terms of welfare and social services. He wants a political candidate for the Républicain Party, the party of Jacques Chirac and Nicolas Sarkozy, himself the son of an immigrant, running against a National Front candidate. He is difficult to dismiss. So far, the coming immigration bill does not break the taboo on statistics. One of the expected fights will take place between Emmanuel Macron's Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, he's a man who wants the president's job, and he wants provisions to give working papers for migrant working in trades that need workers, like catering or construction. And the fight will take against the current Républicain leader, Éric Ciotti, and here again, we're talking about the son of immigrants, who calls this a red line because it would reward, he says, illegality. The result of all this is that the French national mood has changed. Marine Le Pen, the National Rally parliamentary leader, and Jordan Bardella, he himself the grandson of immigrants, the 28-year-old party leader who will head the European election list next spring, are consistently polling over 25% of the vote. This makes the National Rally the most popular party in France, even though it is supposed to be beyond the pale. Emmanuel Macron will remain at the Élysée until 2027, but he no longer has a parliamentary majority. All of this is taking place against a backdrop of economic crisis. It is still considered uncouth to say that you will vote primarily against immigration. But the truth is that it will be one of the major factors in our next elections. For one half of the Senate this coming Sunday, which is the half of the Senate is being renewed, for the European Parliament next June, that is when the National Rally is expected to win big. If the new immigration bill doesn't look like it will bring real change to the current situation, you can expect a big political upset.
Thank you so much for that report on France. Our next speaker is Professor El Mostafa Razarahi. He is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he will be telling us about the interplay of human mobility, peace, and security in the digital age from a Southern perspective. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess colleagues make the job quite difficult to me. Global discussion and a case study. But anyway, I would like first to make some remarks before making my little presentation. I will be quite short and hope to be insightful. So basically, I guess that I'm much more interested in the narrative than policies. And I would like just to visit those narratives that goes with European policies and this mobilization with tough regulation and sometimes a huge misunderstanding between countries from the north and the south. I have little reserve to call them West. It's another issue because it's, even in the global report on migration, they include Japan in the northern part. So basically, the European politics was since 2000, the crisis, what you call it, crisis 2015, has produced huge narrative related to or connecting security, domestic security to migration, and mainly with the focus on criminality, bringing so many data that the most criminals are the foreigners and illegal migrants, or in terrorism, which is not that much true. I'm a co-chair of a working group at AU on the foreign terrorist fighters, so data says something else, and we can discuss it if you wish. The second connection is culture and identity concern, and I guess this is also quite, very controversial connection. The third one is the economic concern, either connecting the migration of the migrant to the fact that they are observing the welfare strain or the job market or job competition. And the final one, which is trying to expand and making a lot of financial mobilization, is the border security, because at least there is some EU bodies who observe money and can make mobilization of funds. Now, talking about these issues, of course, I will not focus on the public opinion, management, by the media, by political parties in the moment of elections, and how this affecting, the serious cooperation between the countries from the north and the south to do the job. I heard, I guess this morning or yesterday, someone is talking about the creation of camps, or what we call it, centre de concentration, for illegal migrants. And he didn't mention that the concerned countries, they reject the project. Morocco rejected, Algeria rejected, Libya rejected, Tunisia rejected, so they will do it. I don't know where, unless they will put it in the sea. So sometimes there is some no realistic analysis, because such project cannot be done without the cooperation between different parties. And the most thing I would like to share is something new, which is not today it's not in the urgent area or in the emergency area, which is related to this new cyber world. I will not call it cyber, virtual world. Today we talk about virtual reality. And I'm not addressing to our people from my generation, because we are all in this room, we are digital migrants. Maybe few are on the other side, they are digital natives. So maybe in the next 30 years, if we are talking about the principle of connectivity, no one can control the values connectivity, the cultural connectivity and exchange. And all those projects, and sorry to say it, those conservative or right-wing projects will fall down. Just for one reason, because if the North is producing hardware and softwares, the percentage of the narrative from the South is beyond 72% and circulating online. And this is very significant, I guess. Maybe we need today to review and to take into consideration that the screen, the internet, is not virtual world. Now it is a virtual reality. And maybe next year with some production, I will not name the companies who are bringing some technologies to be more virtual. Things will be changing. To spend the number of hours that we are spending in the virtual world or virtual reality can be also a moment of migration of values, the impact if people are aware about the identity hegemony. These restrictive policies cannot work. It can be good maybe to reduce the economy impact, the security impact, but they cannot protect themselves, in terms of identity building. It doesn't work anymore, I guess. Even the English, even the American scholarship, they are in the wrong way. Sometimes they bring the fact that English is manipulating, is the most used language online, but English, like the speech of yesterday, like the dollar, doesn't belong anymore to the USA or to the UK. It becomes an international good. And this is something also quite interesting to discuss. So I want just to introduce this discussion. Unfortunately, but I will promise, just yesterday I have a paper on this in 70 pages in Arabic. I will translate it and send it to Danube Institute and Heritage Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. And now we're joined by Dr. James Carafano, who is currently Senior Counselor to the President of the Heritage Foundation and E.W. Richardson Fellow of International Engagement. Thank you.
Thanks
for your presentation.
I want to start by following up on our recommendation from yesterday. I'm so proud of this conference, and my goal or my suggestion is this needs to be not just a conservative confab, but a best of class of issues that really are going to transform the world, not just Hungary's place in it, but something we should all be concerned about. And I thought we saw some of those conversations yesterday. I thought the conversation on economics and energy, I think revealed how really central they are to what our future looks like. I thought all the conversations on geopolitics were absolutely riveting and important, and so that was great. But I would argue the fourth one should be this, as dismal as these guys are, because this is the most important dynamic in global affairs that nobody really wants to talk about. And it's not just because it's eye-numbing with the charts and everything. It's because it's so overladen with everything that we care about, whether it's resourcing, geopolitics, culture, and everything else. It's almost an impossible discussion. Therefore, the only place to have that discussion is in Budapest. So if we're going to keep a topic and come back and hammer it year after year and really be kind of the thought leaders and policy leaders in saying this is the way we need to move, I think demographics needs to be one of that. So the reason why I'm here today is not because they had to stick me somewhere because I get to talk. It's because I want to tell you about a Twitter argument I have, which is not uncommon. But this one was actually with a buddy. We love Ukraine. We agree on everything. And he was tweeting something on immigration or something. And I tweeted back and I said, look, I think immigration is a 19th century answer to 21st century problems. He got greatly offended and somehow he blocked me, right? But my point is the idea of using migration to solve the world's big problems and to solve the problems of the people who are migrating, that is so old school. I mean, of course, there's nothing wrong with migration. Obviously, I'm an Italian American. I couldn't go to France because apparently who knew, right? Actually, they used to lynch Italians and Americans in the 1870s, and they actually just said, "Don't go to America; it's too dangerous for Italians." But my ancestors, being the brave souls they were, they went anyway because they knew that in the end, Italian food was just too big to resist, right? Of course, today all the Italian cooks are Moroccan, but that's a whole nother. But the point I was trying to make is these trails of tears, these mass movements of people, sometimes forced, sometimes necessitated because of economic crisis or environmental. This is a horrible way to treat human beings. This is a terrible way to solve problems and to solve population problems. This is a horror show. And you would think in the 21st century, if there is a problem that we could take off the table, it's not the manufactured issue of climate change or a lot of these other things. Is the idea that masses of people should have to get up and move to solve problems. That ought to be a thing of the past. And I want to argue about a national security argument why we should care about this. It's called, I didn't invent this term, but the weapon of mass migration. and this is not a mythology, every year for decades, every single year for the past decades, even in the perfect age of peace versus the 1990s, there has been a forced migration somewhere in the world. This year alone, there are 40 million displaced Africans. And if you're looking at the balance of future demographics, Africa alone in the near term will have 8 billion people. The notion that we should subject our future to the idea that people could force giant populations to move one place to another as a weapon ought to terrify us. It ought to terrify us as much as nuclear war, as much as real war, and you cannot say that this is just mythology. Like I can well, look, today America has the most open border in the world. So, where's my Italian friends? They had like, I don't know, how many people show up at the island? Like 20,000, 20, how many? 10,000 in one day. In America, we call that Tuesday. Honestly, we've already taken more illegal immigrants in the past year than a third of the Italian population. Granted, we're 33 million people, but remember the guy who said, at some point a trillion is a big number, right? So we're going to crust, 10 million, easily 10 million illegal immigrants by the end of President Biden's term, which will actually at least double the illegal population in the United States, which would, if they were a state in the United States, would be one of the 4 largest states in the country. But the point is what's to keep somebody from exploiting this for national security purpose? What's to keep somebody from just saying, going to a country and say, here's some money, go send 500,000 people to the American border now, because they'll walk in before we can stop them. And that would completely fracture this country. And you can't say, well, that's just, James Bond, because first of all, it's happened to America before. If you look at the Cuban boat lift where Castro intentionally triggered a crisis, it just happened in Europe, in Belarus. It's happened in other places. So this is a real thing. And we need to take this off the table. So how not to take it off the table? Okay, the notion of solve problems in place. Foreign aid is a disaster of a solution. This notion of, we just dump enough money on these people, things will stop. We had a great narrative on Africa and the challenges and everything else, but we've always tried to solve it just by writing big checks and throwing them overboard. And we haven't addressed any of those issues. Every place there is a mass migration in the world today. If you also look at places where a lot of foreign aid dumped in, they also kind of match up pretty good. So it's not just about throwing money at the problem. It is absolutely not about having this notion of the right to protect. This was something that was quite popular in the early 90s. This will, I think, reoccur as a popular idea in Ukraine and other places, that countries should intervene in the affairs of other countries to prevent bad things from happening. This, of course, if there was an official right to protect in the UN today, Russia would be getting the Nobel Prize because they were exercising the right to protect and saving all of these Ukrainians from themselves. So this is a bad impulse. Another bad impulse is we solve this problem. This is like Mike Duran's thing about, well, the Chinese give money, give weapons to the Iranians, so then the Saudis will ask them, the Chinese, to protect them from the Iranians, right? Is to have the right to migration. And this is actually, I believe, at the root of current American policies, is this notion that we'll solve the world's problems by just eliminating restrictions against migrating. We'll let people move anywhere they want. And then that's okay, because then we will create governance systems to just move all the resources around to meet that. And the people that will move all the resources around and make all the decisions, those were the people that thought right to migrate was a great idea, right? So this is another horrible idea. So these are all really bad ideas. And the other really bad idea is to demonize the conversation. To demonize the notion about talking about not restricting, but organizing and the orderly transition of people as somehow being evil and racist and wrong. And we've seen this on so many issues where you can't say that because that's racist. It's not a different answer. It's not a better answer. It's racist. And we have to have the courage and the bravery, which is why we could only have this conversation in Budapest, to say, no, we need to actually talk about stopping these things, and that we're better off helping people stay where they are. And if refugees are forced to leave their homes, we're better off keeping them as close to their homes as possible so we can get them back as soon as possible. Because as soon as we normalize the right to migrate, every evil person in the world will use human beings and throwing them at other people as a weapon. And we will create more misery than has ever existed. So what is the alternative to that? Well, I think there's two parts to this. One is, people say, well, we have to have migrations because we need people, because they're getting less of us. I was in Japan. There's lots of people in Japan. So I don't know how they're all going to be dead by 3,000, but whatever. The answer, if you have a population that is declining and you need more people, the primary answer should be family formation and growing families. Look, there's two reasons why that's a superior demographic solution. The first is families are absolutely the best and most perfect way to grow human beings and make them productive, happy, and empower human flourishing. So if you want people, just grow them. The other thing is, and I think this is really important, a diverse, I don't mean diverse in terms of, one of these and one of those, but diversity in terms of age is one of the most enriching and empowering things in a society. Even if you don't have kids, walking by a playground and seeing a playground full of happy children playing with each other, that is one of the most empowering and satisfying things for a human being. We in the U.S., we have these, I don't know if you have them here. We have these like senior villages. They're in Florida. Like it's just a community of zombies. And we have like senior homes, right? So these really plush things, but you have to be like 80 years old to live there. Shoot me if you ever have to stick me in one of these places. The worst thing for an aging population is to live with old people, right? The most enriching and empowering thing for anybody of any age is to live with families and old people and young people, all in the same communities, all in the same cities. I work at the Heritage Foundation. I am in the 99 percentile, right? Everybody's younger than me, right? If Heritage was actually a bunch of old dead white guys, getting around, I would have left, right? It is a vibrant place, and almost everybody is younger than me. And it's a tremendous culture where 21-year-olds wave their finger at me and tell me I'm wrong. And nobody calls me doctor or mister. Everybody just calls me Jim. And I love this. This makes me want to go to work every day. That's how you create a healthy and a diverse and an enriching society, is to grow a family and a community. So that ought to be your number one tool. Now, if you want to supplement that with migration, I think that's fine. And I think we would all agree immigration's a good thing. My families are immigrants. It should be regularized and it should support the needs of the nation. So I am in the fan of what's called merit-based migration. There are about a dozen countries in the world that already have this model. And not only is it, I think it's also good for a nation to debate who they are and who they want to be. And this should be created in the political space, not by technocrats. Political leaders should get together and they should argue, who are we and what do we need to make this country better, right? And then you decide the merits of that, and you decide politically the numbers of that. What's unconscionable in America today is we are adding millions of illegal immigrants every year, and the American people and Congress never got a chance to say, hey, good idea, or no, bad idea. If you actually look at when Biden ran for president, not one thing in his immigration policy was in his presidential campaign. He never told Americans that he was going to completely open the border and that he was going to decide how many illegal aliens were going to come into the United States, even, by the way, as he actually reduces regular migration. So I think a merit-based system where a people get together and decide for themselves, how many people do we want, what merits are we looking for, that is the right model. So that to me is the two sides of the problem. We, as a community, not just for national security, but for whole other regions, need to be building cooperative structures that take weapons of mass migration off the table. And I suspect The answer is, just like nuclear weapons, what's going to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass migration is not non-proliferation treaties and not international bodies and institutions. It's like-minded nations getting together in their own interest who say, we will not stand for this practice. And on the other side, I honestly believe if nations don't get in the business of cherishing and growing and building families, that they are in the wrong business. I don't say the Hungarian model is the right model, but the fact that we aren't having a debate about what family formation looks like and how to do that and what's the right balance of investment in that, that's just wrong. That's suicidal. That's just stupid. That's got to stop. And I think we have to in America, but I think other places as well, we have to stop illegal immigration in its tracks. So then we can have a real debate about how we want a structured migration to work and what merit-based systems look like. And again, I don't think it's something that's going to be driven by international consensus or global rules. It's going to be driven by nations deciding for themselves. And the great thing about free nations is they can look at each other and they can look at best practices and experiences and decide for themselves how they want to structure their system. This is such an important issue. This is as fundamental as nuclear competition and Ukraine being invaded and whether we should have gas and oil or freeze to death. It is too important an issue to leave to the yahoos. So it's such an important issue that good, smart people that care need to start taking part in it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. I actually want to pose one question to the panel and then open it up at this late hour in the day for some questions from the audience. But I would basically like to pick up from the last theme of Jim's talk and open this idea of international cooperation to solve demographic challenges and gather the thoughts from the rest of the panel. Because I do think that demography and it includes both this aspect of migration and the aspect of family formation, and somehow it seems to me politically, at least in the West and particularly in the U.S., that it's easier to talk about, even as difficult as it is to talk about migration. It's easier to imagine, a policy aimed at stopping migration than it is to imagine completely reorganizing your public services and welfare system, et cetera, and family law in favor of family formation. There were some circumstances that were favorable to that in Hungary, which are kind of hard to replicate elsewhere. The results have been good. I think there's been over an 80%, 83% rise in the number of marriages per year since 2010, which is really the unheralded statistic, I think, even more so than the increase in total fertility. But it is the case, though, that a lot of the bad practices and bad norms have been pushed through international institutions, and at some point, we have to make global arguments or more wide-ranging international arguments about why mass migration is bad and why the best practices around family policy can be shared. So it's an open question for the panel. Are there any signs in the international environment that are positive? We've had a lot of sort of negative expectations and projections over the course of the last hour. So put your imagination cap on. Are there any moments in the near future that you think will cause nations and countries to come together? It doesn't have to be the massive international community, quote unquote. As Jim said, that doesn't really exist. But there are a lot of different international platforms through which people or through which groups of nations push particular ideas. Is there any possibility for that around migration, family policy, demographics, and if so, any sense or broad guesses as to what it might look like? Anne Elizabeth, and then Dr. Rezaei.
That's it. Stop. Having discussed migration issues in Japan a couple of years back, just before COVID, I think, first of all, rather than sort of use, other forums or make it too broad, what the nations who want to have this kind of conversation should find likely partners, and I think that's the most important. And I think that if you put Hungary and Japan and Switzerland, for instance, in front of this issue, you will already find 3 nations who have decided to look at this, and Denmark, for instance, and then you will find nations that have broadly a democratic tradition, democratic policies, and they say we want to choose the way we do immigration. I was fascinated to see that an advisor to then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe told me, we are studying what Europe has done in terms of mass migration, and we have come to the conclusion that we are about 40 years behind you in terms of numbers of immigrants. And we are looking very closely at what you did. And then he paused because he was a good performer, and he said to do the exact opposite. So that was an interesting point to begin with. But first, you find the right partners, and it can be a small forum, and it doesn't need to make lots of noise, and it doesn't need to announce that it's going to get to a result. But find people who think this is a solution to which we want to find a consensus and a civilized way of getting to places, rather than making it a sort of immediately a banner issue. That would be my conclusion.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rosray.
Okay, so since you mentioned Japan, so I spent 22 years in Japan, and I worked on this issue, and I was concerned about it. And I guess the difference between the European management, and I will not name some countries, and the Japanese, this policy to increase the rate of fertility, they did not link it to any cultural value. And they were very frank with their population. It has to do with the economy, the good well-being, that's it. When you connect it to values, it becomes a package. When you want to dissociate it, you can't. And this is something and let's take, for example, the wonderful experience of this country. I am following a little bit. I'm not expert. I will not pretend. But you cannot export it in Europe. And you cannot share it. It's a national single project. It will serve only Hungary. And this is, so here, and I am talking under the authority of Professor David, we have 2 projects to resolve the problem at a national level or at a continental level, or maybe at a global level, which is not working well. I guess the UN is not doing, okay, they are making good reports every year, that's fine, but not more than that. If we take the case in Africa, there is so many misinformation. So many people are talking about Africa as source of migration. But the African migration outside Africa is only 9%. 91% is intercontinental, migration. And if we take, for example, the migration which is absorbing more, it's not Europe. It's Oceania, then North America, then Europe comes third. And if we listen to the noise, sorry to name it noise, we feel that Europeans, maybe the public policies are not working properly, and they are projecting everything on the migration issue or security issue. Maybe the problem is somewhere else. This is my view. Thank you.
No, I was just going to say, hell no. Matter of fact, not only are they not helping, they're making worse. I mean, just look at the example of Italy, which cried out for help in the immigration crisis. And let's be honest, the EU response is, oh, well, she's anti-immigrant, right? And now she's in a migration crisis, so let's not help her because that'll punish her. And we saw the same thing when countries asked for help in Belarus. They were punished. So yeah, we just see this thing in Poland, right? Where you have a government which is very strong in immigration, and they had a scandal where somebody was selling some visas to somebody, and all of a sudden it's, well, let's use this as an excuse to bring down the government. So rather than looking at migration as an issue where we should pull together, increasingly what we're seeing is the opposite, where people are looking at migration as a political weapon to help take down their enemies.
No, but the question isn't whether existing international institutions are useful. The question is whether discussion on family policy, for example, should be only bilateral, or whether there are a number of countries that could be interested in it and you could build something out of that. The example of the Budapest Demographic Summit seems to me evidence in favor of the latter, that there is something that could be built out of it. I think visitors at this the Demographic Summit this past week included Italy, Serbia, Turkey, Qatar, Bahrain, Tunisia, Kazakhstan, like a kind of a wide variety. And if you wind it back a few years, like you have different governments that are showing up at that for different purposes, trying to figure things out. So,
could I have a word?
Yes, please. Please.
Thank you very much. It's working?
It's on, yes.
Yep. I'm not quite sure what word in edgeways I ought to put in, I must admit, because it's an intractable problem. I'm risk of sounding harsh, negative, and pessimistic, to take the view that there's not much scope for international cooperation here in anything other than what to do with people who move from one country within Europe to another one, seeking asylum or just seeking unregulated or illegal entry, and two, getting together to encourage investment on the edges of the African continent in the way that my colleague Professor Collier has suggested, to put a large sum of money into encouraging the creation of factories, service centers, anything which will produce useful employment for the people concerned and profits for the country in which it's situated. As to the rest, national aims about what migration ought to be are so radically different, and national attitudes are so different between electorates and so volatile as electorates change and policies change, that I see no real prospect of getting together to have joint policies of a more general kind on migration, and certainly not joint policies on things like family policy. That's strictly a national government, a national electorate issue. If you look at the aims of the governments of Australia and Canada in respect of migration, and compare them with the aims of the governments of Denmark and the Netherlands in respect to migration, they're entirely different, and they're appropriately entirely different. Australia and Canada are continental-sized countries with space to fill, and they have employment, certainly in Australia, employment-oriented policies, and a very rigorous regime, at least in the past, for dealing with unregulated and irregular migration, as we've heard from the former Prime Minister last night. Denmark and the Netherlands have extremely strict policies from the point of view of, say, family and marriage migration, which are very rigorous and which have succeeded in reducing migration in that stream to 1/3 of its previous level. And what's more, encouraging integration of the populations of immigrant origin in Denmark and in the Netherlands themselves. So I won't go on and on about this, but I'm afraid I'm inclined to reach for a bucket of cold water about these proposals.
Well, thank you very much. I think actually, the nature abhors a vacuum, and when the international dialogue is filled with basically anti-family proposals and an aggressive anti-family agenda that's pushed by major powers through international institutions, if conservatives aren't at least attempting to do the same, then it's too bad for us. What's that?
What do you mean by anti-family? Sorry.
I mean. So I think international institutions have been have not been fostering the idea of the traditional family as the core element of society, but instead have been pushing, since the 1960s and beyond, generally the idea of the sexual revolution and that a more liberal social lifestyle is the way of the future. So, I mean, that lies at the core of the demographic problems that people are responding to on other wavelengths. So, if we don't have an international, pro-family policy where we are, advocating and sharing best practices with regard to promoting the traditional family, then what do we have except for, fear? I think.
I'm sorry, I couldn't agree less. But discussing
that's good. I mean, it's good to have disagreements.
I'm sorry, I don't want to start an internal debate.
No. Those are the best. That's what it's for.
The views of the audience, much more importantly than hear us waffling on anymore. But I just wanted to register the fact that I think that's with the deepest possible respect, a mistaken conception and a mistaken non-solution. I think we ought to concentrate on not so much on family policy, which I think in many respects has been very satisfactory in many parts of Europe, and deal with the issue at hand.
Well, thank you very much. I'll leave that comment with you, and would be happy to discuss more later. But for now, we'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience, if anyone would like to pose one.
Thank you so much for, my name is Kelechi Carlo, University of California, Riverside. Very fascinating conversation. My question is to Dr. Carafano. To what extent do you think that policies that sell weapons to Africans, South Americans, and elsewhere, creating instability in their countries as part of free market ideology, is simultaneously one of the push factors for the migration occurring from those territories? That's one part of my question. The other part of the question I would like a response to has to do with how we can bring about family-oriented demographic shift in the way we want it. To what extent does that violate people's freedom?
Yeah. On the second part, my argument would be we should stop cultural imperialism. So we should cease the West, the United States, trying to impose what we think are appropriate cultural values on the rest of the world. So regardless of where people are in the gender issue, I think it's inappropriate for the United States to have a comprehensive view on LGBT rights and how they fit into a society and be lecturing other countries on whether that's good or bad or not. Likewise, I wouldn't say that the United States should be lecturing to a country on what family structure should look like and what extended family structure should look like. I think it's inappropriate. So I would say, ceasing cultural imperialism would be the starting point for that. And I do think that would actually be a foundation for cooperation, which really gets to the answer to the first part. I think the African people, and I think we share that. I actually hate the term Africa as if it's this giant amorphous blob, which, to be honest, is how we tend to look at it. But I think people have to take agency for their own community. And I do agree with Roger's comment before that part of the great success in South Asia and other places is people took ownership of their country, and they had vision and their values. And then what they looked for was not somebody to underwrite them and write them a check. They looked for a partner that would help them realize their vision. And I think the future in Africa is partnership. I do think that, and we could argue past history all over the place, I do think that the United States, many European nations, many nations in the Middle East, India, South Korea, Japan, I think they all have interests in Africa. I think they all have things to bring to the table in a partnership role. And in my mind, that's always the best foreign policy. When you can do a good and it's in your interest to do that. And I do think the answer is partnership. And why I mentioned all those countries is I don't think alone any of us has the capacity or the interest to really impose, even if we wanted to, big solutions in Africa. I think if we coordinate together in our partnership, we bring a lot of capacity and capability to the table that really, I think, outmatches what anybody else bring. So I look at something like the Mattei plan from the Italians, not in the specifics of the plan, but conceptually as an idea, it's an idea that's not based on foreign aid. It's not based on the projection of military power or counterterrorism or building hard spheres of influence. It's based on a model of partnership where if you're interested in helping the human flourishing of your people, and I can do something that assists in that, and the stability and success of your people is in my national interest, I think that's worth doing. I think that's the model that we need.
We have time for about one more question. Steve.
Although it is another University of California question, so we're kind of dominating. Little ancient history in 10 seconds. In 1966, you had the blackout for New York City for all 5 boroughs for a day. Happened again in 1977. Bang, 9 months later, you had a baby boom at local New York hospitals. Right. Now, when the COVID lockdown was announced for 3 weeks to flatten the curve at the beginning, I thought, we're going to have a little baby boom out of this in 9 months. Not only did that, I think, not happen, but fertility rates continued to decline in the Western countries during COVID. And I'm a little baffled by this. Is it simply that we had the distractions of the internet and Netflix, as Melissa mentioned to me the other night? I mean, to be only slightly mischievous, is the lesson here that actually we should join the hard greens and support a policy of rolling blackouts as a fertility measure? I'm not entirely facetious about that, but...
Actually, so I actually spent a lot of time looking at the blackouts in New York in my Homeland Security role. So the big difference between the 2 blackouts in New York was context. When the blackout happened in the 60s, actually the later one in the 80s, when those blackouts happened, and the one you're, well, actually flip them around. It's actually the big boomlet was in the 60s. And matter of fact, there was a movie that was made with Doris Day and Rock Hudson about everybody having sex in the blackout, right? And the reason for that was because New York was in a good place. People felt very good, and the lights went out, and everybody said, let's go have sex, right? In the 70s, the city was in, or the 80s, whatever the date was exactly, 77, the city was in absolute crisis. And when the blackout happened, everybody went out and rioted. And so it's the context that matters. So the reason why there isn't a Bainley boomlet during COVID in the US is because the context is all bad. We're not a country that supports family formation. We're not a country that supports monogamous marriage. And that's why it doesn't have, but I will say, I got a grandson out of COVID, so I'm okay here.
Others on the panel.
Does this work? Yeah. No, thanks. Yes. Every demographer I've heard of said quite clearly that at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, there wasn't going to be a baby boom. It was entirely a fiction of newspapers and the media. It was never likely to happen. The reason being that something of that kind is a threat. It threatens unemployment, it threatens possibly poverty, it threatens possibly disease and even death. It's not a favorable environment in which to think about having children in a context where even casual sex nowadays is protected by a number of very effective prophylactics. So it was never going to happen. And it's a nice media story, but it should be confined to the media and has no part in any serious demographic discussion. There are a few examples where blackouts in the third world have led to a baby boom because of the disruption of supplies of contraception and other things associated with a regular life. But those are few and far between. In the developed world, I think it's a non-starter.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time and also to the end of this excellent conference. So thank you first to all of our participants and to all of you for coming to the third Danube Geopolitical Summit, and we will see you again soon. Thank you so much.